Hi everyone, welcome back to Blurred Box. I'm Chloe.
I'm Haven.
I'm PJ.
And I'm Sophie.
And this is our podcast where 4 online students in 4 different places around the world from Stanford University's online high school come together every week to discuss a variety of topics, ranging from world events to our lives in an online school, and invite guests to take part in our discussions and share their views. This episode, we'll be having a special emphasis on the current digital divide between students in this time, where everyone has now been forced into virtual learning due to the COVID-19 epidemic. Joining us today, we have Dr. Tomohiro Hoshi, our head of school and an instructor of philosophy and mathematics at Stanford OHS.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me for today's
Thank you for joining.
Dr. Hoshi, introduce yourself. Give us a bit of an introduction to who you are and I guess how you got into OHS.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Thank you, Chloe. And I am head of Stanford Online High School. I think this is my 4th year in the role, but I've been at the school for, almost 12 years. I think this is my 12th year at the school, where the school, is going through the 14th year, of the school. The way that I got into OHS is that I was finishing up my PhD in philosophy at Stanford University. For my 5th year, I was looking for, I was done with my dissertation and some exciting projects, the PhD program. And I came across this interesting project of developing high school curriculum in philosophy and also, in this online education platform. And back then, that was the time that MOOCs and other sorts of online educational platforms were arising. So that was immediately interesting to me. So I joined the school as a person who was developing this, now called core curriculum in the high school,
really
and also a teacher.
I hear also from reading your profile, you had your education initially in Japan. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, I was born and raised up and I'm originally from Tokyo. So I did my undergraduate studies in the University of Tokyo.
So as mentioned, a lot of students now are forced into online education as the physical schools are being closed due to the coronavirus crisis. But those who are less privileged or reside in rural areas lack the device and or the broadband needed to access this novel way of education, for example, whether it be in the US or Europe or Asia. And one human rights concern that has been aggravated by this digital divide is global inequality. So we would like to get your perspective first on how you think about this current digital divide in our society and what we can do to bridge this divide.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a wonderful theme. And, definitely I'm excited to be able to have this conversation with you guys on that topic. So first thing, in the current situation, what I think of is certainly this gap that existed, in the world has been even made wider, so to speak, The current impact of the COVID-19 situation is really disproportionately, hitting the different kinds of worlds and different kinds of people, different kinds of areas and so forth. And what was bad is getting even worse, And then the gap and the divide that you are describing there is getting bigger, as well as other kinds of issues and divides. So that's the kind of, first thing I can say. And another thing I want to say in that context is, people might have thought of online education or online learning or online teaching, as a solution to, various sorts of issues. But I think that's a misconception, because it's only a tool, which might produce some solutions to some issues. That's kind of a very important distinction that we might keep in mind. So just having online education, I think, as your, frame of discussion was, I think implying, just having online education doesn't help, Online education alone doesn't help.
So I guess I'm curious what you think the most important skills are to kind of instill in these new, online teachers and how they can utilize this tool of the online platform. The teachers just aren't trained in how to teach through an online platform. And that's been surprising to me because I've kind of had a lot of years with online school. So I was kind of just accustomed to teachers knowing what to do.
Yeah, so I have almost 2 opposing views on this. One view is that, I have been right in this circumstance, particularly right as you know, OHS has been helping educators outside OHS, right? In that context, I've been really telling educators outside OHS that, right, think of you are going into a new classroom in a new school, right, that you started working for, right? There are lots of things that obviously, you need to be making an adjustment for and so forth, right? Think of this, in that sort of way. You always, right, can find some good translation of what you have been doing in the traditional classroom environment. Your job is to do this translation from the brick and mortar kind of environments to online. And in this circumstance, you have good tools, right? Probably 5 years ago, we might not have good tools for this and that purposes, but now we do, right? So this is kind of a response to the question, right? What should teachers, keep in mind? Well, first, know that this is right. The place that you are going to is a continuation of what you've been doing, right? So that's kind of a one mental set, right, mindset that I often encourage educators to have. But the opposing viewpoint is the one that's assumed in the kind of the question that you asked, right? Which is represented in the recent survey by, I think this is One Schoolhouse, the nonprofit organization called One Schoolhouse. They did this survey for all public school teachers in the United States. Or I mean, not all, sorry, like sampled, public school teachers and asked them about online education and edtech. This is prior to the COVID-19 situation, right? And what they found out was almost more than half of public school teachers are using some online education and edtech tools every day, right? Which is really surprising to me, right? But then 90% of them, right? This is kind of underscoring the kind of viewpoint of your question. 90% of them, feel that they don't know what they are doing, right? Because of the lack of training that they've had. So certainly, right, what teachers really need to have is the suitable training of the kind that they need. And one interesting situation right now in the COVID-19 circumstances that there are lots of actually good training. There are unfortunately bad kind of training that's available, right? But those trainings are now provided for free. So I think that, it's a better situation now in the sense that teachers can at least, teachers do have now a selection of resources that they didn't have in the past to get trained. And now they need probably some advice on which are the good ones and which are the bad ones.
Now you're saying that with more students and teachers as well being basically forced in a way, not really, but being more accustomed to this way of learning, online learning, how do you see this, if at all, affecting the methods of education in our future?
So I think that actually in this virtual conference this morning, the conference name is ASU GSV, right? ASU, obviously, as you know, like Arizona State University, and GSV Global Silicon Valley venture capital company. This is a one very big educational and edtech conference that happens annually. This year, right, it happened virtually. One of the sessions was certainly focusing on this, right? Like, what is the impact of this current situation on our future education? And everybody was saying, right, like this certainly accelerated the kind of movement toward online education, right? As I was kind of illustrating already by this example from public school teachers, right? More than 50% of them using some online education tools every day, right? Along with it, right? For instance, like let's say like 1/3 of our undergraduate students in the U.S. are taking some online courses, which might not be very surprising, but 1/6 of undergraduate students in the U.S. are actually pursuing diplomas exclusively online, right? Isn't it really surprising, right? 1/6, right? So online education has been already coming to the kind of a central stage, so to speak, of education, but the current situation certainly by pushing in quotes, right, as you say, lots of educators in the world into the online space certainly accelerated that sort of movement. But I definitely kind of agree with that sort of statement generally, but in a kind of an interesting twist, right? Because
Yeah.
as it's kind of evident in this kind of way of thinking of the situation, right? Like people are being pushed, right? So some people, right, like, are experiencing bad, right, online education
Right.
and
Yeah.
teaching. And I
Yeah.
mean, in the frame of our current conversation, right, some people, don't even have access, right, to those things. And maybe have some partial, access, but that's not going to give a full experience or a good experience at the end, right? So I think that what's going to happen is people kind of, right, like, oh yeah, this online education movement is getting accelerated in the sense of having more of online education in the future. But I think that I probably disagree with that, right? Because people now get exposed to
Mhm.
more of online education. So I think this, so to speak, selection process, right? Evolutionary theory, right? So the selection process in terms of good online educational platforms or systems, right,
Yeah.
over, right, bad
Mhm.
online educational choices, right, it's gonna be, that's the one that's accelerated, which I think is a good news for educators and teachers, right?
I'm curious if you think that this move towards like utilizing online platforms more would is like creating a more accessible future for education, or if that's like a hurdle that we'll have to overcome to make sure that it's available to everybody.
Yeah. So I think my basic answer to that great question is
Sure.
that, like, we want to come back to the statement that I made right at the beginning of this conversation, right? Which is,
Right.
right, online education is just a tool, and it alone wouldn't provide us a solution to challenging problems, right? I have been seeing, right, not just me, like lots of people have been seeing more
Right.
examples of researches that have shown, right, oh, online education isn't really good for everyone.
Because we live in a society that inherently
Oh, yeah.
limits people's access to their education, especially during this dire time. And isn't it a human right? Access to education, we have a right to that. But as a society, we're failing to uphold that right now. It's quite saddening that like COVID-19 and the effects of it has basically crawled its way into the gaping divides that are apparent in our world. And it's, like you said, slowly pushing them even further apart, making them wider. Just
It
my
definitely
thoughts on
has
that.
highlighted a lot of shortcomings in at least the public education, I think, for sure.
Yeah. With the given crisis right now, and as mentioned, a lot of students are having the issues accessing the whole virtual learning process, and the effort of installing the software and getting the broadband network is just too much for them. The effort might just not be worth it to them. What would you have to say to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's really unfortunate. And then, as you guys have been kind of discussing, and the issue has been there, right? And online education, yeah, I remember, like, I was trying to make this point, right? Even prior to the current COVID-19 situation, there have been researches that showed, right, online education, despite the original promise, right, was simply, widening the gap, right? So actually relying on that tool, which was functioning that way, right, prior to the COVID-19 situation, right?
Mhm.
But I think we don't have to be that pessimistic, right? Because certainly online high school, right, at Stanford, our school is modeled. Our model might not
Right.
solve all kinds of issues surrounding this, accessibility issues. However, at least
Mhm.
kind of providing this good example in the field can kind of at least, right, relieve the pessimism about online education in that sort of angle.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely one of the main concerns, I think, as well, that you've put it very well. The world is kind of, going into this black spiral of disparity, right? The hope is being lost by a lot of people by this hard effort to even gain education, to go outside their homes. A lot of it is quite detrimental to people's mentality, I believe, and that's where a lot of depression is coming in. And I think that being Stanford OHS students, we're given a lot of support in that aspect because our teachers and our whole faculty is quite accommodating to the fact that a lot of stress people are going under right now is quite impactful to how they go about life. So could you give us a bit of a rundown or an insight as to how OHS might be handling this in comparison to other schools, and what other schools might be able to learn or take away in terms of dealing with this particular issue from our school's example?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, certainly. In terms of what goes on in the school for students, parents, and teachers, right? While we try to keep things as we can, right? As we have been doing things, right? We provide flexibility, right? Because again, this current situation is hitting different people differently. So we definitely need to be accommodating and being flexible. While again, right, as we are uniquely situated to be able to provide this greater educational setup for the for the students during the current situation. So that's the kind of approach we've been taking. So keep things as has been with enhanced level of flexibility for different students with different circumstances. Um, but for people outside the school, as I think you guys know, the kind of approach and kind of support we've been providing is to help educators. So this comes back to some of your questions earlier in this conversation, but our approach to work with educators outside the school has been pretty unique, I would say, like looking at the other kind of resources that other companies and schools might have tried to produce. Because we, instead of providing some scalable solutions, right, some big webinars for educators to learn about what it is to do online education might have had thousands of people, right, from 100 countries and so forth. But in our case, we had a big webinar at the beginning, but very quickly we took an approach of having smaller group conversations, as we do, right, in our online school classrooms, because that's really heart of the core of what we do. And really we really wanted to demonstrate, right, that this kind of close communication in this online environment between students and teachers is possible, and so forth, right? Really kind of letting them experience this sort of space.
Other schools being able to do the same thing that you've mentioned with the small class group size. Another good thing about it is that there's a sense of security to it, I think, that you might agree as well. Our school has a particular platform that we use, as you know, called Adobe Connect. And this is quite different from a lot of the software that everyone else uses, which particularly tends to lean more towards Zoom, right?
I know there have been issues with Zoom classrooms recently, specifically with people hacking into them and disrupting class discussions, also known as Zoom bombing, which raises questions about student and teacher privacy and safety. As an educator yourself, what do you feel would be the most effective way for students to handle the transition to an online platform, especially considering that most of these students aren't accustomed to this different style of teaching, and that these schools were not prepared for this sudden change in the first place?
Right. Yeah, exactly. No, this is a wonderful question. And this is, I think, really related also to, right, what is this current situation, right, leading to, right, in terms of the future education? I think one impact is going to be that, and this is more of a good kind of impact, I think, right? I think, many schools would realize some additional needs that they might have been actually aware of, but they weren't really proactively addressing those needs, right? This information privacy and such. I think they will anyway, right, after this, right, have more resources allocated, hopefully, right, by the board of the independent schools or right by the districts and such. And indeed, right, going back to the survey I already mentioned earlier in this conversation, right, One School House survey. One of the priority programs that educators were seeing, right, in this current circumstance of edtech rising and online education, right, rising, is really in these information privacy. But right, the issue is that people are aware of those, but schools haven't been, right, in general, proactively addressing those things. So right, so it's kind of interesting, or even understandable results of previous situation, right? Schools not having enough resources to address those issues that they might have been aware of, right? We are seeing these news, right? Like as you mentioned, like some Zoom meetings have been hacked and all that, and in New York, right? Department of Education already banned Zoom and so forth, right, for their online alternatives. So certainly, we have made, right, in our school with the huge support from Stanford online. By the way, Zoom we use within Stanford framework that's also HIPAA compliant. So, it's kind of a different Zoom environment from the ones that, people outside of our school might be using in some circumstances. But so I think definitely schools now got a completely like strong wake up calls on this issue that they are being aware of, and they will have more resources.
Yeah.
So
you do hail from Japan, and I'm curious as to how education there differs compared to the US, and especially now with the crisis. How do you see it differing even more so now, including Japan and the rest of the world, going into the virtual classroom environment?
Right. Yeah. So yes, that's a huge question for me. And then if you can invite me into like maybe 3 other podcasts like this, I can kind of cover it more fully. But just to kind of pick up on some highlights. First, the system that's supporting education is extremely different. So in the case of Japan, it's more centralized, right? Like perhaps the cases in Asia, right? In other countries in Asia, right? In the US, it's certainly still centralized to some extent, but to much lesser degree. And so in Japan, right, like the flexibilities that even private schools have in terms of curriculum or, choice of textbook even, right, that's centralized, right? Even college professors in private universities have to submit their syllabi to the Department of Education and so forth, right? That's still the case in Japan, right? So teachers actually don't have too much flexibility or as much flexibility as many or some at least teachers might enjoy in this country. And certainly, right, that's impacting the current situation because, right, lots of schools might have wanted to do some unique and reasonable online, alternatives, but they couldn't really, right, because they weren't allowed to and so forth.
One World Box segment that we do have, come up with words that you would use to associate with negative outcomes of this current epidemic for education.
Right. So inside is negative and the outside is positive, right? Is that the? Oh, yeah, got it. Yeah. So I want to say, like in the theme of what we've been discussing, certainly I think I want to say something like, widening the gap or maybe exacerbation, right? Is that English, right?
Yes.
Exacerbating the existing issue gap.
I think it, with the finding the negative outcomes, actually, it's a bit harder to think of, put more emphasis on, the positive outcomes of this educational crisis with the COVID-19. Are there particular words or phrases that you might associate with that particular topic?
One theme that came out in our conversation was, I think that more, so I think more wide, like online education, more widely consumed, right, at least.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's allowed because, right, that can lead to different kinds of outcomes that we've been discussing, like people are now aware of these options, and that might accelerate this selection process, so to speak, right, in the sense that I was describing,
right.
And also, right, some folks would have more opportunities to be able to address the issues that they were aware of, right? We touched on that in the information policy kind of situation. So certainly, online education used by many more people, I think that's a really great consequence of the current situation that gives actually hopes for our future education.
I think you're right about that, in that
online schooling sometimes can have a negative impression among other people, but I think now with the current situation, the idea of being able to have access to education and learning platforms, no matter where you are, has become increasingly important, especially because of COVID and how it's forced all schools around the world to switch to online education and online learning platforms.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And to add on to that, the whole world has now been experiencing and given a taste of what our online education is, and something that you're an expert in, right, being the head of our school. Would you say that this, like, perhaps the words transitional and evolutional come to mind for me? Because now that everyone has been given this taste of online education, that even those of all social classes, like we've been talking about, this whole gap between the lower class and higher class, do you think that this particular crisis might push the government or maybe the Bureau of Education to do something and help the underprivileged students who can't access the internet or everything we've discussed so far, and resources that they might need to transition into a new era of education?
Yeah. No, I think that's a really positive prospect of, right, like after the current situation, which we can make, hopefully can make happen, right? The reason that I frame it, and this as being another theme, right, throughout our conversation today, right? So online education, again, like itself doesn't provide a solution, right? This tool, might be used as kind of an apparent solution, right? Even when it's not actually providing a substantial solution, if I'm making any sense there, right? So, we've solved this access issue because now, right, all students have online access.
Yeah.
No, that's nothing that we have been trying to solve, right? Access of education. Right? So I think we should really monitor, right, what the government might be doing, right, in this front. What's really the essence of what's happened, right? Like, providing more computers to more students alone wouldn't solve the issue. We would like to make sure that the quality of education is enhanced overall and that's reaching more students, right? Is it really happening? After our, seeing, let's say, more online education tools or, internet, becoming, available to more students.
Right. And I wanted to kind of add on also to what you two are saying about how families right now are struggling for their kids to have access to internet connection, especially the people who are underprivileged. And so I've heard in France, according to Bloomberg News, that they're beginning to broadcast lessons that are related to what kids should be learning on certain TV stations. And that's also happening in some parts of the U.S., like more major cities such as Los Angeles, upstate New York, and Detroit. And they're trying to implement similar programs where students, if they have access to a TV, which even if they are underprivileged or don't have as much money, they might still have access to a TV where they can still learn things that would be important to their education and development, which I think is really neat about something that Chloe mentioned about being progressive and evolutionary and being able to give everybody some sort of access to learning, even if they don't have the same income or the same opportunity to do that as other people.
Right, yeah, I think Pooja makes a very good point with that. Before we wrap up this conversation, as we are reaching end of time, Dr. Hoshi, it was really nice having you. Is there any other last thoughts that you might have on this particular discussion?
No, thank you. I really appreciated your great questions and prompts in the conversation, and I certainly would like to, if it's possible, have more opportunities to be discussing topics about education and other things. So thank you so much for having me today.
It was a pleasure having you.
Yes, thank you.
We would love to have you for future episodes. But before we let you go, is there a particular message that you might want to send to educators out there who might be listening to our podcast, or students, for that matter, that you might give as advice as our head of school for OHS, the global leader for online education, and or as a personal opinion as yourself as an instructor in philosophy and mathematics?
Yeah, so really the main message that I have in mind is that good online education is possible, right? Online, doesn't imply bad, right? In this context, right?
Yeah.
Online education can be really good. We gotta be really thoughtful, right, to think about and then produce it. But I'm proud of having been a part of such a great school, which demonstrated that.
Right.
And I did like to help students, educators, and parents understand that, for their, future choices of educational platform.
Yeah, some positivity.
Exactly. Thank you so much, Dr. Hoshi. It was really a pleasure speaking with you. And thank you guys for listening to Blurred Box with Chloe, Haven, Pooja, and Sophie. If you like our show and want to know more, check us out on Anchor, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or please leave us a review on iTunes. Be sure to join us next week for another episode of Blurred Box. We release episodes every Saturday.
We would love to hear your feedback, suggestions, and questions, which you can email to blurredbox88@gmail.com. And if you enjoy listening to our podcast, you can follow us on Instagram or Twitter at blurredbox for the latest updates.
Right. And we'll see you guys soon. Be sure to tune in next Saturday, and we'll give you guys another really interesting discussion episode with another special guest. Stay tuned for that. We'll see you guys next week. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.